Hello and welcome. The difficult conditions facing the injured, sick and impoverished children of the Palestinian territories moved him to take action. And he did, by setting up the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. But his work has always been complicated by the challenge of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This week on One on One, meet a humanitarian making a real difference, Steve Sosebee. The racial segregation that surrounded his typical and comfortable middle-class American childhood taught him the meaning of opportunities. In December 1988, as a young adult, Steve Sosebee took a rare step and went to the Palestinian territories during the violence of the First Intifada. He witnessed people with horrific injuries, particularly children, and decided action was needed. His first step was to take a 10-year-old boy home to Ohio in 1990 to treat him for devastating grenade injuries that had cost him his legs, his right hand, and an eye. At the start of the 1990s, he conceived the idea of the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, the PCRF, to connect the medical world and caregivers with sick and injured children in the Middle East. It was around then Sosebee also met Huda al-Masri, a young Palestinian woman also working with injured kids. Their cross-cultural marriage was unusual at the time, but solid, and they raised their two daughters in America while still focusing on the crucial work of the PCRF, even as US-Arab tensions grew post 9/11. It hasn't been easy, but in spite of huge challenges, both political and personal, Steve Sosebee has proved to be one of the most dedicated humanitarians around. Steve, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
You're a very motivated man. I mean, you're one of the most motivated people I've come across listening to the things you do. What is it that drives you in the morning? What is it that says, you get up and you say, I've got to do this?
Well, I think the most important thing in my life is the fact that this type of work, which I'm leading a group of many important and valuable volunteers all over the world, is that we're saving the lives of children. And that's what it basically comes down to. I mean, our work involves dealing with very sick, injured, disabled kids who have no other option but the work that we're doing to improve their lives and in many ways save their lives. So I remember that every morning when I wake up, and it motivates me significantly.
How do you balance the stress of seeing what they go through and the conditions and the difficulties you see they face? How do you balance that with the need to be able to stay positive?
Well, I think, you have to be realistic. We're not going to be able to change the lives of every child who needs help. We're not going to be able to save every child who's in distress or in need of saving. But we are able to do as much as we can for those who we can reach. And that's where I try to stay grounded and try to stay focused. I feel that's what fuels my drive every morning.
Well, let's trace back how you got to where you are. Your early years. Tell me about your childhood.
I was raised in the classic American Midwest small town, very not conservative politically, but simple life with all of the trappings of what is Hollywood Americana, with baseball, apple pie, swimming in the summer and snow sled riding in the winter. All of those things which are very common in how the Midwest is portrayed. It's true, that's how I was raised. But I was also raised by parents who believed strongly in the desire to instill in their children the importance of working for social justice. And whether it was in your neighbor or in somebody half a world away, it was our obligation and responsibility to always support and work for social justice.
What was it you saw in them? What is it that they did specifically that made you realize this is what they believed in?
My parents. One of my first memories, well, we lived, the first town I was brought up in Northeast Ohio was a segregated town, even in 1970, 71, after the Civil Rights Movement and after the assassination of Reverend Martin Luther King. Still, there were many segregated towns, and even in Ohio, which was the North. We were not the South. We were not Jim Crow. And even we lived in a segregated town, and my father worked for desegregating, for fair housing, because minorities and blacks in particular were not being provided the opportunity to live in white areas. In the town that we lived in, blacks were not able to buy property. My father worked very strongly for desegregating the town that we grew up in, and to the extent where our house was fired upon by people who didn't agree with our view, by racists. We had police protection going to school. My sisters were followed by police cruisers. And so at a very early age, I was only 5 years old when this happened, I saw what an individual, my father was just a high school teacher, working for social justice, the costs, but we never regretted that. That was part of the price you pay for working for equality and for justice, and it's a responsibility, and that's how I was raised.
How did your mother influence you? What characteristics did you get from her?
My mother was a nurse, and is still a nurse, and she was the most loving and compassionate woman in my life. And she raised me always with such a feeling that I was loved, which for a child, that's important, of course. And, you know, a lot of kids don't have that. And I always felt that from my mother, that kind of maternal compassion, which is important for the development of a child. And she also, you know, supported my father and believed in working for social justice as well, and also instilled in me those values.
Tell me about your earliest memories, though. And you were talking about the issue about the segregation and so on, but the things that stuck in your mind from those early years.
I mean, you know, as a child growing up, it's just carefree. But I just remember that, you know, it was a different time. America was a different place. You didn't have the displays of gratuitous wealth and consumption, which is common now. People kind of, if you had a lot, you didn't display it, and it was, and I kind of respected that, because, you know, a lot of people were just getting by, and it was a working class, middle class community, and people respected each other, and there was a sense of community. We still have that, but it's not as much as it used to be. And you know, we used to be able to play outside and go around our town, and now kids don't do that. They are not able to just go out and be free. And you know, you had that sense of freedom and adventure growing up that really became part of my spirit.
When did you first discover places, well, when did you first discover the Middle East, for example? When did you first get to see what was going on there?
I had a chance to travel to Palestine in December of 1988, which was the first year of the first Intifada, and I was with a group of other college students. All of us were active at our universities on the issues of social justice, in particular the issue of Palestine. And so I was 23 years old, and I went to the West Bank and saw with my own eyes and got to interact with people on a human level, hear their stories, you know, see how they live. And it just changed my life even more so, because again, you see how similar we are, but also how difficult it is for people to struggle just to get by with some of the basic things that we take for granted as Americans or people in the West.
And your relationship, I guess, with the Middle East began then?
It did. Indeed it did. That was, I determined when I finished that trip and went back to finish college that I would take what I'd seen, the lessons that I'd learned, the stories that I'd heard, and do something with it. I felt that I had been given really a precious gift, these people opening their lives to me and their stories, and that they were counting on me to come back and to help them by exposing their stories or telling their stories to people who didn't know how they were trying to live and endure under occupation.
How did your relating these stories that, you know, what you had witnessed in Palestine, of the life of the Palestinians, how did they go down with Americans who generally tend to have a very different view?
Well, you know, when I first came back, I had a history of the Middle East class at my university, and the professor was not keen on, he had a very different view on the Middle East than I had. And I was really astounded by the way he would teach class when I came back, because everything was so blatantly one-sided. And I used to argue with him, not because I was a combative student, but I felt he was being anti-intellectual by not providing students who didn't know any better. You know, there's two sides to every story. And just hearing one side to students who are trying to learn, I felt was wrong. And I had just seen firsthand the other side. So I came back, and finally he got sick of me kind of opposing every point that he raised historically or politically in class on the Middle East, and said, okay, you can do a presentation on what your trip was like. So I had taken these slides, and the day of my presentation, I had come up to give my lecture, and as I started to come into the hallway, the nephew of this professor, who was in the class, took my presentation and smashed it on the floor before I had done anything, before I had said anything. And actually, it was an astounding experience, because I never realized how violently passionate people are about this issue until then. I mean, I knew obviously there was strong feelings, there was a religious aspect to it. But to take that, to deny someone the right in a college atmosphere where you're supposed to have a free exchange of ideas, the right to even just present a trip that I had just gone on, to violently prevent that, one student preventing another student violently, was my first experience really in coming back to the States and having a chance to speak about it. And it, you know, again, it's something I learned from, and I feel today that it wasn't a great thing, but I learned from it in a good way.
When did you realize you could do something actively? When did you say to yourself, I have to make a difference?
I think it was when I met this boy who had suffered a bomb injury which left him without legs and without a hand. And when I was able to just basically take a photograph of him and start the process of getting him treatment, and I realized that it was possible. It was possible for a working class kid from Ohio to impact the life of a little boy a world away. And
this is Mansour.
This is Mansour Abusnini from Hebron. That's right. The first child that we were able to treat, and it was really an amazing story in the sense that here was a kid from Ohio, didn't speak Arabic. A 10-year-old boy didn't speak English. We had completely different cultures, religions, worldviews, and yet there was a common tie between us. We became friends, and we became connected in a way which doesn't exist between language and between cultures, and that continued. That was what strengthened us, enabled me to really take him into my home and get him the treatment he needed. And I realized some things are so much stronger than language or culture, certainly stronger than politics, and that's a human connection that exists in all of us. You just have to open your heart to allow that connection to take place.
Well, Steve, we'll see what that led to and where that took you in just a moment. More with Steve Sosebee when we return with One on One.